Once you've got your basic needs met, what gives you your meaning? It seems one thing is we need some kind of sense of autonomy, a sense of freedom, the sense that I'm making decisions about my own life. The second thing we need, relationships with others, because we're social animals. We're not just, free-floating, rational, economic man creatures. And the other thing we need is a sense of purpose that's bigger than ourselves, something that kind of gets us out of bed in the morning and drives us. And that's the kind of work of Viktor Frankl and people like that who wrote about man's search for meaning. But I think that looking at that idea of how we can collectively change things taps into the relationship part and the larger sense of purpose part. And also it's about the agency, that sense of I can make a difference. I've got freedom in solidarity with others. So now I think of it, it's a really interesting thing that we can make meaning through being change makers in society. And I think that's important. Of course, it can be exhausting going to political meetings every night. I'm not saying that this is the only thing one should do in one's life. One does need to lie and have a long bath or do whatever you need to do to step away from the world sometimes. But there is a kind of engagement that history teaches us is energizing for us in our own lives, but on that larger scale of how we can change the landscape of the future.
Okay, Roman, welcome to the show. It's great to be speaking with you again.
Wow, it's a huge pleasure. I'm looking forward to the adventure of where this conversation takes us.
So your new book is called History for Tomorrow. What would you say is the big idea underneath this book that the whole thing's built upon?
What's it all built on? It's built on an exasperating cry of frustration with our politicians and policymakers who seem so caught up in the present moment that they, think that they can hardly see beyond the next election or the latest tweet, or they're crossing their fingers and hoping that the tech bros in Silicon Valley are going to sort out the world's problems for us, with geoengineering and things like that. And yet here we are in an age of polycrisis, from a climate emergency to risks from AI, threats to democracy. And it seems to me that, and this is where the frustration comes in, that those in power, let's say, are failing to draw on one of our most important resources for thinking about the future of humanity. And that resource is history, the layer upon layer of wisdom that lies in the past. And in a way, the big message here is actually a message about hope. And I didn't realize when I was writing this book, History for Tomorrow, that I'd feel so hopeful at the end after exploring these topics, which seem to be about everything that we're doing wrong, like the ecological crisis and, the risks from genetic engineering. Yet, actually, when you look through history, it's amazing how often human societies have risen up, often together, people acting together to tackle crises, build cities and civilizations, challenge injustices. So, I'm not an optimistic person. I think at business as usual, we are heading as a species for ecological and technological self-termination. But I do have a kind of hope that even against the odds, we may well rise to some of these crises and challenges. So yes, hope.
Very interesting. Now, one of the things you quote in the book it's from the Maori tribe, which I think are based in New Zealand. But anyway, I walk backwards into the future with my eyes fixed on the past. So a big theme here is we can learn from the past to build a better future, build a better present. And what do you feel are the main or the potential benefits of taking this approach? Like, why is this so important? Why have you written a book about it, I suppose?
Well, if you're driving a car, you'd never drive and fail to look in the rear vision mirror. We always need to be looking backwards. And a bit that Maori proverb, kia whakatomuri ta haere whakamua, I walk backwards into the future with my eyes fixed on the past. She said it there. I think it has an essential wisdom in it, which is that thinking about history and the past in all its different ways, it's not about being able to predict the future. It's more about using history as a kind of a counselor or a guide. So I think the better we know what we've done in the past, the bigger our imaginations, I think, for doing something different in the future. So Let me just give you just one example. So often today, people often talk about, oh, we need a circular economy where we reuse and repurpose, refurbish. We don't waste our resources to keep us living within planetary limits. And it's an idea, it's sort of an extension of recycling, really, but we really need to do it on a radical level in order to prevent biodiversity loss and using up all our rare earth metals and all these kinds of things. And if you look through history, there are these like amazing examples of societies that have had what we would today call a circular economy. And I've just found it absolutely fascinating to discover them and open my imaginations to them. So in that case, if you go back to Japan in the middle of the 18th century, imagine you are standing on the old Nihonbashi Bridge in the ancient Japanese city of Edo, today's Tokyo, and there are people twirling their wooden umbrellas and people carrying fish to the market on the other side of the bridge. And what you notice if you looked at this civilization, well, two things really. One is that Edo, today's Tokyo, was a massive city in the 18th century, had over 1 million people living in it. So far bigger than London or Paris at the time. But the other thing was that they had this sort of circular economy, partly because Japan wasn't trading much with the outside world. So they had shortages of timber and cotton. So a tradition of patchwork developed called boro, which means tattered rags, where old bits of cotton would be sewn together into garments and passed on from generation to generation. Or if you had a kimono, you might wear it until it wore out, and then you'd turn it into pajamas that you'd wear at night. Then you chop it up and turn it into nappies, and then you would use it as cleaning cloths and finally burn it as fuel. Or there were thousands of businesses in ancient Edo doing things like collecting used candle wax to form back into candles, or down and out samurai repairing old umbrellas on the streets, or people would come to your house and pay you for your human waste and sell it on as agricultural fertilizer. So in a way, it was one of the world's first examples of a large-scale ecological civilization, which was by no means a perfect society. It was feudal. It was a military dictatorship. It was patriarchal. But another interesting thing about it was that it was also a time of cultural flourishing. People often say, oh, environmentalists want to send us back to sort of living frugal lives, living back in caves, with no culture or anything. But actually, Japan in the 18th century was the time of the paintings of Hiroshige and the poetry of Basho and street theater and sumo wrestling, if you're into that kind of thing. I think it tells us something quite inspiring, that actually you look at our society today and you think, actually, it doesn't have to be this way. There are alternatives to consumer capitalism. There's a whole society there in Japan that we should be thinking about. And if I think about it, I think if we were doing Eudaimonomics today, we wouldn't allow for the sale of something like a regular iPhone, which uses over 50 elements of the periodic table and gets thrown out after less than 3 years. In a world of Eudaimonomics, we would say, the companies would say, sorry, in 5 years' time, you can't sell phones like that. You'll have to sell a modular phone where you can, repair the screen and change the battery, and that uses recycled earth metals. There is a phone like this. It's called the Fairphone, developed in the Netherlands. They're a little bit clunky at the moment, but they're getting better and better. But you just set the target, everyone will adjust. So, in a way, writing a book like History for Tomorrow, I've been sort of astounded by these things that I never knew about. I kind of feel like, why hadn't anybody ever told me about ancient Japan and its circular economy? That's the kind of thing I've tried to put into this book.
Well, it seems that the real benefit of this, Roman, is that you're exposing yourself to all these different ways of living that we might not consider all otherwise. And just by becoming aware that this existed, it gives us an alternative route forward too. And something else you mentioned in the book as well about the Cuban Missile Crisis. One of the reasons that didn't end in disaster was because Kennedy had read a book about. Can you maybe tell us about this? What was the book called again?
Yeah, it was called The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman, who was a popular historian. And she wrote this book in the early 60s. Kennedy read it, was totally obsessed with it. He gave copies of it to all of his inner circle, and he sent it to military officials around the world and the US military. And it was a book about how Europe had kind of stumbled into the First World War through a series of miscalculations and bungles, really. And when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, right in the middle of it, he was very aware that if he made the wrong kinds of decisions and was basically too aggressive towards his opponent there, which is the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, that again the world could stumble into nuclear conflict, mass destruction. And there was a moment where he actually turned to his brother, the Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and said, "Look, I don't want people to look back on this time and describe it as a book called like the Missiles of October, like the Guns of August, where we kind of made these terrible decisions." And it actually this book encouraged him to take a much more diplomatic solution, searching for the conflict. And that's actually what resolved it in the end. And I think it was a really brilliant example of politicians learning from history. Of course, very often politicians totally fail to learn from history. So there was a case where, I don't actually write about this in the book, but in I think the end of 2002, where Tony Blair invited some historians and political experts on the Middle East to come and basically ask them, should he join the US in invading Iraq? And they all said, no, don't do it. It's going to be a disaster based on, the history of what we know of that region going back a century. And he totally ignored them. And well, we know what the result of that was. So politicians sometimes learn, they sometimes don't. They manipulate history all the time, of course. But I think, what's really interesting to me, although I really like that Kennedy story because it tells us something about the value of history, the problem with it for me, and I reflected on this a lot when writing this new book, was that that's really about an elite politician, a leader, a statesman, kind of drawing lessons from history. And what really interested me is how everyday people can be change makers in their own lives to create the new histories of the future. And also to look at history not as a place for warnings, because that's what Kennedy was doing. Like that old saying, those who can't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. That's the idea of, learning from history, but looking at everything that's gone wrong. And I think, well, let's look at what's gone right as well. It's a bit like positive psychology in a sense, now I think about it. But in relation to history, let's not ignore the bad stuff. Let's not ignore colonialism and interwar fascism, but let's also try and be constructive here about what has gone right and what can we take from that in our world today. And it's not like the parallels are completely exact. You've always got to be careful with analogies. Every war is not another Vietnam. Every financial crash isn't like the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression in the 1930s. But with creative thinking, you can make connections through time. And, it's an old idea, learning from history. It goes back to the ancient Greeks like Thucydides. But I really want to kind of revamp it, the idea of applied history and bring in some of these more positive stories and the stories about everyday people.
You touched on it there briefly, but could you maybe tell us about this idea of history from below and why this is so important, and how might someone maybe take this kind of approach to learning about history? Because like you say, it's or Thomas Carlyle said, history is usually the biography of great men or something like that. How can we see it in a different way?
That's exactly what he did say. And this was the traditional view of thinking that history has been sort of determined, the big decisions, that movers and shakers are, the Napoleons, the Churchills, the Mandelas, the famous statespeople. But after the Second World War, a new way of thinking about history started emerging in the Western world. And it was actually influenced by Marxist historians who started saying, well, look, we're hearing all these stories of the kings and the queens and the prime ministers and so on, but what about the stories of working people? And then that idea started being extended to, what about the stories of women? What about the stories of enslaved people? And over the decades, gradually, very gradually, this idea of telling the stories from below about history has become more important, and a deep recognition that you can't really understand where we've come from by just looking at those in power, those at the top of the system. And I think what's really important about that is that it's kind of empowering for us as individuals, as change makers in society, to know that actually you don't have to be a Napoleon or a business tycoon or a great savior like Mother Teresa or Nelson Mandela to make a difference. Actually, communities have made differences, trade unions have made differences, social movements on the streets have made differences, all things that we can potentially be part of. And it's about, I think, in a way, it's about adding another dimension to your own life on some level as well. It's partly about this is how we change the world, but it's also about how we get meaning in life. It's about, I always think, if I think about what does a meaningful life look like, right? How do we, once you've got your basic needs met, what gives you your meaning? It seems one thing is we need some kind of sense of autonomy, a sense of freedom, the sense that I'm making decisions about my own life. The second thing we need are relationships with others, because we're social animals. We're not just, free floating, rational, economic man creatures. And the other thing we need is a sense of purpose that's bigger than ourselves, something that kind of gets us out of bed in the morning and drives us. And that's the kind of work of Viktor Frankl and people like that who wrote about man's search for meaning. But I think that looking at that idea of how we can collectively change things taps into the relationship part and the larger sense of purpose part. And also it's about the agency, that sense of I can make a difference. I've got freedom in solidarity with others. So now I think of it, it's a really interesting thing that we can make meaning through being change makers in society. And I think that's important. Of course, it can be exhausting going to political meetings every night. I'm not saying that this is the only thing one should do in one's life. One does need to lie and have a long bath or do whatever you need to do to step away from the world sometimes. But there is a kind of engagement that history teaches us is energizing for us in our own lives, but on that larger scale of how we can change the landscape of the future.
I think that's a phrase worth repeating, just what you said there about we can create meaning by making change in society. That's something that should be really emphasized to young people in schools and stuff, because I think the message young people get nowadays is that if you want to have meaning, you've got to start your own thing, you've got to do your own thing, you've got to be a leader, you've got to be an entrepreneur and all the rest. But what you're saying is sort of, you can find probably more meaning if you get involved in a collective cause and you sort of just muck in and you're part of a group and you're doing your best to improve the society we all live in. So I think that's a really important point you brought up there,
Yeah, actually, just the other day, a few weeks ago, I was at an Extinction Rebellion protest. It wasn't really a protest, it was more of a picnic. We were outside Windsor Castle, and the theme of it was about upgrading democracy. So how can we improve our democracy so that our governments actually tackle the climate crisis and stuff like that? And the way it worked is we all sat in little groups of 6 people, and we're given these cards, just randomly, groups of 6 got together. We're given these cards, and on each card, it gave us a bit of information about how British democracy works, like how the electoral system works. And it gave us some alternatives, like, well, in some places, like in Ireland, they've had citizens' assemblies where they randomly select people to discuss an issue like abortion or biodiversity loss or something like that. And they've got another system in this country or in that country. And, they've got lots of referendums in Switzerland. And we had a kind of a facilitated discussion. And there were like loads of these groups because there were hundreds of thousands of people there in little groups of 6, all discussing. And then this is going to connect to what you just said, by the way. And then there was a barcode on one of the sheets of paper where we could then upload our top 3 pieces of advice for how to upgrade democracy, what we should do. And we could vote on everybody else's things, which were appearing on the screen. And there were all these police officers around on horses because they thought we were dangerous radicals. But we were just basically having a picnic and talking about democracy. But the thing that really struck me about it was just how much fun it was, and how much everyone enjoyed talking with strangers in a semi-structured way. So it wasn't just random conversation about the weather. We were talking about democracy, but you didn't need any specialist knowledge. But we're making change because what we were doing is, even though we haven't yet changed how democracy in Britain works, we were creating the kind of seeds of that, or the seeds of what's sometimes called by the 14th century Islamic historian, I'm sounding obscure now, but a guy called Ibn Khaldun said that the thing that holds societies together is what he called as-sabiyya, which is an Arabic word meaning collective solidarity or group feeling. And he said that the civilizations that succeed have strong asabiyya, this kind of social trust or social glue. And the ones that fall apart, the civilizations that crash and that are crumbling, have very weak asabiyya, maybe because societies have become very unequal, for example, in terms of wealth. And so they get fragmented. And so we were building the asabiyya. And I think through those conversations about democracy. And you can build asabiya in lots of different ways. But and I think this is what everything that you're doing with your podcast and all the events you put on are really kind of doing. It's bringing people together to share the ideas that matter. This is change making, right? And it's about interconnection at the deepest level in a world that tries to fragment us and separate us. I don't know. What do you think?
That's so interesting. I think this, what do you call asadia? Is that what it's called?
Yeah,
Asadia?
asabiya, exactly.
If on a scale of 1 to 10, it seems like society is probably, our society at least feels like it's probably a 2 or 3 in that direction. So it's like, how do we switch that? You reminded me of something, David Sloan Wilson. So he's an evolutionary biologist who we've had in the podcast. Are you familiar with his work?
Yeah, I can see one of his books out of the corner of my eye.
And the thing he said was something like, the closest thing you'll get to utopia on Earth is working in a group towards a purpose that you all really care about. That's the closest thing you're going to get to utopia on Earth, because it taps into our ancient primal instincts, and that's kind of what we're built for. But something I wanted to ask you about, Roman, is, so the first interview I had with you was about Carpe Diem, right? Which is a book that's very, you could say, very now focused, very present focused, seizing your day now, seizing your life now, making the most of the time that you do have. Then the next book was The Good Ancestor, which is really all about future generations. And then this book is about the past, about looking back to move forward, So I've heard you say that the common theme, these books are almost a trilogy, you could think of them. And the common theme is this idea of temporal intelligence, not emotional intelligence, but temporal intelligence. Can you tell us what this is and why this is important?
Yeah, this is an idea I've been playing with a bit recently, the idea of temporal intelligence. Because, as you know, back in the 1990s, the idea of emotional intelligence became very popular due to a book of that name written by Daniel Goleman. It kind of swept the world, and it swept me in a sense too. I wrote a book on empathy um, before those three, which is all about one of the aspects of emotional intelligence. How do we step into the shoes of others? What difference that can make to our lives, to society, to our politics? But as you say, in the last 10 years, I've been writing this loose trilogy on our relationship with time, relationship with the present, the future, and the past. And I think what it's ultimately all about for me is that although I think we do need emotional intelligence, I think we also need this concept of temporal intelligence, which I think of as a cognitive skill of thinking on multiple time horizons, short term, long term, forwards, backwards, linear, cyclical. All these different ways that, of course, people have explored, in the past, and the need to sort of slow down or be more in the present moment, for example, or the need for long-term thinking, as I've written about in my book, The Good Ancestor. But I like thinking of it as a kind of a core skill of who we are, because the amazing thing about humans is we're really good at thinking across different time horizons. A chimpanzee, for example, might get a stick and turn it into strip off the leaves and turn it into a tool to stick into a termite hole. But they'll never make a dozen of those tools and sit them aside for next week, put them aside for next week. But that's what humans do, because we have a capacity to think long term. But we can shift. We can look at our phones at one moment and then the next moment be thinking about planning for our pensions or planting an acorn in the ground. We can be thinking about our childhoods or thinking about 18th century Japan. And we developed this capacity to dance through time, the temporal pirouette, quite early when we're sort of 4 or 5 years old, even. And yet we don't really nurture that capacity. And the way our social, political, educational institutions work doesn't nurture it, but we need to. Partly, of course, you need to think long term for your own life, on that sort of that individual level. Like me, I'm a writer. Writers notoriously, like me, never put away money for their pensions. And my kids are saying, "Dad, haven't you put away any money for your pension?" Oh my God, what's going to happen? And that's a bit of probably too much carpe dieming that I'm doing. But of course, as individuals, we need to think on multiple time horizons. But then as societies, we need to do that too, particularly long term, to think about the slow violence of the climate crisis, which is here and now, but it's going to be a hell of a lot worse by 2050 and 2100, when my kids will still be alive, maybe. If they live that long, they'll be 92. That world is not science fiction. That is an intimate family fact. And so temporal intelligence is, in fact, just before talking to you today, I've been talking to somebody in Brazil about business leadership, actually, and the way business leaders need to get their heads around this idea of temporal intelligence and escape from the short-term cycles, to learn about the past, to think about the future, and to think of it as a real skill, something that we can get better at. So let's see where that takes us. It will be some time maybe before temporal intelligence is taught in schools, but maybe we can set up a museum of temporal intelligence that can recalibrate our minds and set us on a different path of cultural evolution, as David Sloan Wilson might put it.
Maybe it's your next book, Temporal Intelligence.
Well, I have been thinking of that. I wasn't going to say that to anybody, so you put the words into my mouth. I'm not quite certain yet, but I have been toying with that idea, a tiny little book on temporal intelligence.
Okay. I'll keep an eye out for that. I did the Camino de Santiago there a few weeks ago, and I stopped in a town called Leon in Spain, not in France, Spain, and they have this amazing cathedral there. I think it went up around the 13th century, like it's ancient, right? And it's this incredible structure. And when I was there, I was reminded of I think it was a concept from the Good Ancestor. We talk about this idea of cathedral thinking. And I realized there when I was there that multiple generations of people would have worked in this building to put it up, and that must be so meaningful to know that your life, your actions here are going to extend beyond you into the next generation, the generation after, So it was just something that came to mind there.
Well, it's a really interesting idea, the whole idea of cathedral thinking, because it's about both the past and the future, because through human history, we've embarked on these kind of mega projects that we know would never be finished in our own lifetimes. The cathedral is the classic example. Like some of those cathedrals, I don't know how long the one in Leon took to be built, but would, take 300, 500 years. And at the same time, as we cast our minds back to that tradition, it's also about the legacies that we leave, as you say, that to know that you've left something in this world that others will benefit from, and that you will never see the fruits of that yourself directly. But of course, we don't need more cathedrals. I think we've got enough cathedrals, actually, depending on your religion. But I'm not of that persuasion. But I think we need the ecological cathedrals and all sorts of other social cathedrals we need to build to connect us with the living world, to connect us with each other. And that's, as a writer, actually, now I think about it, if I think about what is the legacy I want to leave, it's not that I want my personal name to be up in lights 1,000 years from now or 100 years from now, but I do hope that some of the ideas still speak to the generations of the future, that in a way the cathedrals of ideas are there, whether it's a concept like, cathedral thinking itself, which I've tried to spread, though I didn't invent that term, or temporal intelligence, or being a good ancestor, in a way that my hope is that those ideas are kind of floating around in the world. And I think any of us as individuals, we think about basically human beings, by the time they reach their sort of midlife, 35 to 45, start thinking about their legacies. What are they going to leave behind? But we tend to think about them in very different ways. So some people might be like Alexander the Great, who wanted to leave monuments to himself all over his empire, like a Russian oligarch wants a football stadium named after themselves, a kind of egoistic form of legacy. And then another form is a kind of familial form of legacy. So anyone who has children, they want to leave something to their kids. So they see themselves continuing in their children's lives. But I'm actually kind of interested in these more universal legacies, which are about helping the universal strangers of the future. Like a cathedral does, or like maybe some books do, some books don't. And I think that's really interesting as an individual, just to ask yourself, what do I want my legacy to be? Imagine it is, your child's 90th birthday party in the future, and they're talking about their father or their mother, and about the legacy that they left, this dead departed ancestor. sort of think about what would you like them to say about you? You know, what legacy do you want to leave? What trace? Though, in fact, one final thing as I continue this long answer to your very excellent question, I spent some time at a Buddhist meditation retreat over the summer. And I think probably if you asked some of the monks and nuns there, um, they would probably say, well, what legacy do I want to leave? I want to leave no trace. Uh, I want to leave almost no legacy on some level. How about you? What legacy do you want to leave? Do you want to leave a legacy? What comes into your mind?
Uh, so two things here. Well, before I started my business, when I was like maybe 19 or 20, I just had the idea. I was on a hike up a mountain one day, and I said, yeah, I want to start a business that helps people improve their lives. So if I can share ideas that help people improve their lives, I'm happy. Whatever vehicle that takes, I don't mind. But I think what you're saying here is really making me think about, like in the same way that fish swim in water and they probably have no idea what water is. I think humans swim in a cultural soup, and this is what Carl Jung would call the collective consciousness. And I think really the aim of our lives is to put something into that cultural soup or collective consciousness that makes it better for the rest. And I think that's what's cool about being a writer, for example, is because you're putting things in there that are, lighting people up and changing directions and all the rest.
Yeah, I like that way of putting it. The way I kind of think about it, I think, is that we need a biosphere that provides the air we breathe. But then we need an ethnosphere, which provides the cultural air we breathe. And the ethnosphere is the ideas, the worldviews, the assumptions, all the stuff that we put in that cultural kind of soup, as you say, and that we can draw upon that shapes what we can think and not think. And, to just contribute to it in a small way could make a big difference, depending on who breathes in the bits of the soup. So that's
For
me
sure.
starting to mix the metaphors up a little bit too much, but there we go.
Yeah. Something else I heard you say in another interview, which this just came to mind, but I think you have two ash trees. Are they near your office, or and you're saying that these are external lungs for you. And I thought that's a really cool way, because then your body's not just what's inside your skin. It's like those there are literally contributing to your health, and that's part of you, and you're interacting with them every day.
Yeah, I mean, that idea, of course, you can go to many indigenous cultures that will talk about that the earth is not a resource, it's a relative, that the rivers are our relatives, the trees are our relatives. And I understand that idea on a kind of intellectual level in some way, but I don't really feel it deep in my bones. But then when I read that the two ash trees outside my garden, which I can see as we're on this call, out of the corner of my eye, those ash trees provide enough air for oxygen for 8 human beings. And I sort of realized these are my external lungs. And as you said, our bodies don't end with a flesh and bone or with a skin, but who we are is in some way outside what we think of as us. And so there's a kind of a scientific route to something that's very deeply important, which is the idea of biophilia, or our love of the living world, our interdependence with nature. And if I think about stepping back about what is it that makes a society survive and thrive for the long term, or a civilization continue rather than fall, well, I think one thing is an aspect that we already spoke about, which was that social glue of asabiya, that intra-species solidarity, species with that solidarity within our own species. But we also need interspecies solidarity. So that sense of deep interdependence with the rest of the living world. Because if we don't care about it, we will just keep exploiting it and pushing ourselves over the limits of biodiversity loss and ocean acidification and CO2 emissions and all those kinds of things. So that idea of the trees as the external lungs, I mean, at least it works for me. And I think different things work for different people. But I feel, I feel that myself is bigger than myself, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, yeah. Well, like you say, it's almost a scientific route to transcendence. You're getting there by observing the natural world, and I think that's kind of beautiful. I want to start asking you about some of the examples from the book, Roman. But before I do, so I'm writing my first book as well at the moment, and I have to ask, how do you find these crazy stories and things like Edo in Japan? Like, what does your research process look like for writing a book?
Yeah. Um, it's long and convoluted. I mean, it takes me about 3 or 4 years to write any one book. That's the sort of starting point. So I don't do it. I don't know if that's fast or slow. That's just how long it takes me. I do vast amounts of reading. So just to give you an example of this new book, History for Tomorrow, the way I started was I identified 10 major crises facing humanity in the 21st century, like climate change, risks from AI, threats to democracy, things like that. And I sourced those from reading the academic literature on civilizational collapse, existential risk, surveys of global risks. So I came up with those. And then for each of them, I then asked myself, okay, what can we learn from history to help us think about getting off fossil fuels or dealing with AI? And in order to do that, I had to partly get help from experts. So I would say to somebody, okay, there's a chapter of my book about migration and how we create tolerance in a world of many, many migrants, because that's where we're going. By 2050, maybe 1 in 10 people on the planet might be crossing borders and, people on the move. So how are we going to all live together? Big question of tolerance. And I heard about this through my general reading. I'd heard about this period of Spanish history called Al-Andalus. Between about the 9th and 13th centuries, there was an Islamic rule of southern Spain. And it's a period known as the convivencia, or in Spanish, the living together or coexistence, when basically Christians, Muslims, and Jews managed to live together in relative harmony. There were still tensions, there was still violence outbreaks, but it's a fascinating example of the opposite of a clash of civilizations, of several different kinds of civilizations living together. Now, I am no expert on that period, but I know people who are. And so I asked people, I said, okay, tell me the 5 most important books to read on this topic and 5 most important academic articles. And that got me started. And from there, I started reading. And then what I did, and this was a really important part of the process, I would draft a chapter of this book. So based on doing vast amounts of reading, and talking to historians a bit and things like that. And then I held what I call kitchen seminars, where I invited people literally around my kitchen table to debate and discuss early rough drafts of the chapters of the book. And some of them were experts, like experts on medieval Spain, but some of them were just friends, musicians or artists. And I'd feed them a nice vegan lasagna, and they would read, chapters, and I do a little presentation of them. But basically, we spend 3 hours arguing about them. Or, and I'd say, look, help me. How can I make this better? What don't you understand? What do you disagree with? And people come up with all sorts of great thoughts and ideas and insights. And so I think I've learned a lot from those kinds of processes about writing a book, which I could easily have just done by sitting in my study alone or in the Bodleian Library at Oxford University, which I did spend lots of time in. And I guess the other little thing I'd add to this is, as a writer, I am boringly disciplined. I go to my local coffee shop at 8 o'clock in the morning. At 9 o'clock, I sit down in front of my computer, I turn off the internet, and I work until 1 p.m. and try and write 700 words. That's it, And then the afternoon, sort of editing and reading and taking things further. So tell me about your book. What are you hoping it to become?
It's a book which aims to help entrepreneurs create a business that they actually love the process of running. They go to work every day, they're excited about it, and they're optimizing for their internal subjective experience of doing the work, not external markers, not the money, not the status and all the rest. Like that's kind of the aim. And obviously taking practical things into consideration as well. But it's just like it's I suppose I'm not sure in the title yet, but it's all about like I suppose intrinsic entrepreneurship, like values-based entrepreneurship, energy-based entrepreneurship, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a good topic. And, that's the kind of topic where you can, because part of the research will have to be talking to lots of people. But, you've been spending many years now exploring the ins and outs of human psychology and human behavior and motivation. So I look forward to reading that.
Cheers, Rowan. So what was I going to say? There was something I wanted to say before I asked this question. It'll come to mind later. I think we should just jump in with some of the examples here. Um, Something that I found fascinating was this idea of the hidden history of the radical flank. And, you know, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. And what this reminded me of is when I was a kid, so I had a brother that was 1 year older than me, and he was always like a bit of a trailblazer. Like he was always like, just doing all the things he shouldn't have done. And that made life very easy for me because then if I wanted to do something, I'd be like, well, sure, Rory did that. So this is no big deal, you know? So it was, you'll probably, when you explain this, it'll make more sense, but you want to elaborate on the concept.
That's a brilliant analogy of the radical flank in action. So the idea of the radical flank, this is a kind of slightly nerdy bit of social movement theory, which I used to be very into, but it's become extremely relevant and important today. And the idea of the radical flank comes from the general idea that if you look through the last few hundred years of history, when governments have instigated radical or transformative changes, it's been typically because there've been disruptive movements which have amplified the kind of crises of the time. But movements tend to be successful when they come in sort of two forms, when you've got a moderate mainstream movement and then you've got a kind of more extremist movement on its edge, the radical flank. So one example that you alluded to there was, think about the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1960s. You had the moderate mainstream movement around Martin Luther King Jr. doing the sit-ins and stuff like that. And then you had the Black Power movement, the radical flank, Malcolm X, Nation of Islam. And what they did is they made the mainstream movement look much more acceptable by comparison to much more moderate to those in power. And Martin Luther King Jr. knew this as well. And you used to say, look, to the white liberal establishment, if you don't give us, the Civil Rights Acts and things like that, then more and more of our people are going to join the Black nationalist movement. So just like with you and your brother, where you were a beneficiary of his radicalism, and that the space was created for you. And in a sense, what the radical flank does is it shifts what's called the Overton window, which is kind of the space of, or the range of policies which are politically acceptable. And there are many examples of it. It's not just in the civil rights movement, but the suffragette movement in Britain in the early 20th century was a split between a moderate and a radical flank, or the anti-slavery movement in Britain in the 1820s was basically moderate. They wanted very gradual change. And then there were this radical flank. There were uprisings by enslaved people in Jamaica in 1831 and things like that, which accelerated the change. And of course, it all relates to today, which is about how, for example, the climate activists are operating, because a lot of people get very upset at groups like Extinction Rebellion or Just Stop Oil for, throwing paint over the glass covers of paintings or for disrupting roads and things like that. But actually, in a historical sense, they are part of the radical flank. They're creating the space for some of the more moderate movements. They're changing the conversation. And I mean, I believe in this radical flank theory so much that, I have actually left the library and left my study and sometimes gone onto the street with my teenage daughter, laid down in front of the Houses of Parliament in London and blocked the roads. And I know it is annoying commuters, but it's going to infuriate future generations even more if our governments don't act. And I can't think of a better way to be a good ancestor than joining the radical flank. So it's one of those things where what I try to do in the book, actually, it's funny. Just today, there was a review of the book in the Dutch press in one of the major Dutch newspapers. And the reviewer was kind of critical at first, saying, oh, this Krznaric, he's far too radical, he's going to scare off lots of readers. And then the review says, but I read the articles about the arguments about the radical flank, and actually it's quite convincing, really. That it's actually, he's being quite reasonable. He's not trying to scream and shout at us. And in fact, that's what I've tried to do in the book. You look at the evidence, and the conclusion I come to, it's too late to leave the problems of our time to simmer on the low flame of gradualism. And I'm not saying everybody needs to be on the street by any means. There are people that need to be writing books, creating artworks, teaching in schools. But going back to what we were talking about earlier, I think a lot of this is about a bigger sense of we rather than me. It's about doing things together of whatever kind. It's about knitting our societies together so they can be resilient in the face of change. It's about, as you're talking about with your book, in a way, the idea of getting people to do work that they love, that feels aligned to their values, working with others. This is what makes a society work. Societies don't work when we're just pursuing our self-interest, and it doesn't make us very happy anyway.
Definitely, definitely. It makes me wonder. I know King and Malcolm X they didn't see eye to eye for most of their lives. I think towards the end they had some kind of reconciliation. But I just wonder, did Martin Luther King realize just how much Malcolm X had actually done for him just by being that radical flank for him, And
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think you're right that in the last couple of years of his life, there was a kind of a reconciliation. And the way history has been written has tried to portray them as being very divergent on their approaches, which they were to some extent. But I mean, certainly King knew that the Black Power movement was, in a strategic sense, helpful to the civil rights movement because they they were able to portray themselves as different from the more from the radicals. Um, but I think what's really interesting today, when you look at today's ecological movements, so some of the more mainstream ones, let's say Friends of the Earth, they actually are happy to endorse and support some of the more radical ones like Extinction Rebellion because they know that those more radical ones actually help amplify the issue. They put it on the table. And so there's a sense of a deep understanding of how the radical flanks work. Even though it's, I know that if you take an organization like Just Stop Oil, most people disagree with their tactics, of being very disruptive, of throwing, orange powder all over the Wimbledon tennis courts and stuff like that. Most people disagree, but actually the evidence seems to suggest quite clearly, really, that it has a net positive benefit on converting people to be interested in the issues. Not that they all want to become radical activists, but they put the environment higher up their own political agenda. But we also have to remember that we're living in a world of very, particularly in Britain, where I live, a very sort of authoritarian government, which fails to realize how important these radical flank organizations are. In fact, just the other day, I sent a copy of this new book, History for Tomorrow, to somebody who's in jail, a guy called Roger Hallam, who's one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion. And he's in jail for having been on a Zoom call. He's in jail for 4 years for having been on a Zoom call to plan a road blockage to protest climate change. And if you think about that historically, which is what I do in my book, he's kind of like a bit like the equivalent of the suffragettes and Martin Luther King Jr., these people who got arrested in the past. And I kind of think, like, have we learned nothing? That these are the movements and the people who actually are the change makers of our time. They give democracy its very vitality, even though I know they can be annoying.
I think it's such an important idea, and just becoming conscious of it, I think, can really help people that are actually trying to make change in the world. So super interesting. What about coffee houses, and what can we learn from the emergence of coffee houses was it 17th and 18th century in Britain mostly?
Yeah, the coffee house has a brilliant history, which in a way can be traced back to the rise of the printing press in the 15th, 16th century, which in many ways, what the printing press did, it did a bit the same as what social media is doing today. It polarized people. Because, we often talk about how social media algorithms get us just reinforcing our own views as we get fed the same news feeds. And so you get pro-Trump, anti-Trump, pro-abortion, anti-abortion, whatever it is. But actually that was happening in the 16th century when Protestant reformers like Martin Luther were spreading their critiques of the Catholic Church by using the new printing presses. And it kind of inflamed the religious wars of the 17th and 18th centuries. And it also led to the persecution of outsiders. Like in Germany in the 16th century, around 25,000, mostly women, were executed for the so-called crime of witchcraft, for doing things like having apparently, ridden on a broomstick with the devil to go and burn down a town. And the printing presses at the time spread these fake news stories, sort of 16th century clickbait, because it was very profitable. But the printing presses then did something else, going back to your question, which is that they combined with another technology which emerged in Britain in the late 17th century, which was the coffee house, which came from Turkey. By 1700, there were about 2,000 coffee houses in London, for example. There were coffee houses also in Paris and other places, but London was the hub of it. And you'd walk into one of these coffee houses and you'd be offered a bowl of coffee for a penny rather than a cup, normally a bowl. And where you would sit down normally would be at a communal table. Now, these communal tables, which were covered with the pamphlets and periodicals of the day, this is where the printing press was important because it had spread literacy and education. So you'd sit down and read there at the table. But more than anything else, you'd be sitting there talking with strangers at the communal table. And the coffee houses of London specialized in different topics, some in scientific conversation, some in business conversation. But above all, they were political talking shops where you would talk about the radical ideas of the day, anti-slavery or republicanism. And, if you think about it, if we in our world today where we're so fragmented from each other, it really raises the question of how can we revive that coffee house culture? Because in a way, the coffee houses were like schools of democracy or schools of citizenship. That's how we learned to be citizens. And I think today we need a kind of 21st century caffeine fix based on that history. And this is what this book is all about. It's about taking these kinds of examples, saying, okay, how do we apply it today? So one of the great examples I've been thinking about is, trying to create digital coffee houses. And an example of that has emerged in Germany over the last few years. And it's called Germany Speaks, Deutschland spricht. And what it is a project that started by a newspaper called Die Zeit, the Times. And what they did is they advertised for people to join this platform. You basically have to answer about 7 questions which sort of tell you about your political views. And then what they do is they have an algorithm which matches you up with someone who's got really different views from you. And they've had over 90,000 people since 2017 have conversations with each other online about their very different political views. On average, more than 90% of the conversations go for over an hour. 33% of them go for over 2 hours. And the data, I read a Harvard study about it this morning, actually, shows that levels of polarization or out-group persecution drop by 77%. So it's like a digital coffee house. And of course, online, we often think this is a terrible place to have conversation, really, because of all the anonymity and things like that. So they've tried to control for that, create a coffee house space, which is really effective. But of course, I think we also need to do them face to face as well, kind of analog coffee houses. I mean, if you imagine the 30,000 coffee houses that are in the UK today, if they were conversations between just 10 strangers a day for a year, that would make over 100 million conversations each year. And I think that's partly what we need to knit our societies together, especially when they are so fragmented, they are so divided. So I think, in a way, that this is, it's history of the coffee house has these unexpected solutions, or at least imaginative possibilities. And that's what I've tried to convey in this book. I've tried to offer these I've tried to cherry pick, in a way, systematically, some of the best examples from history that can help us reassess who we are and how we operate as a society.
Just thinking about that idea going forward, I love the idea, like, if you had one coffee house in every town in the UK and Ireland, that they had like a specific dedicated space where there's like a big table and you go there for the specific purpose of having a conversation from somebody from a different background, that would be so interesting. And it would just make for there's such a lack, especially like I'm from a small town in Northern Ireland, and there's no public space anymore. When we were younger, we used to go to the pub or go to a nightclub, and that's where you'd see everybody. Now there's just nothing.
Right. And that's a great example. I think if we did that, you imagine some coffee houses would specialize in different things. And they would, there's this thing called the Death Cafe movement, which is quite interesting, that in over 80 countries, over 15,000 meetings to talk about death have occurred in existing cafes. And it's just a movement where you just go along and you meet other people to talk about what it means to die or how you want to think about death. So it just doesn't necessarily use the communal table idea, but they're doing the same thing by using an online platform to connect people who then go and meet up in person once a month to talk about death. Why don't we have more of these things? I think there's a huge kind of missing potential. All of these coffee shops are specializing in who can make the best pain au chocolat and croissants. They should be specializing in who can create the best conversations between strangers.
If anybody that's looking for a movement to start or an initiative, or any entrepreneurs out there that fancy giving that a try, that is I think that's definitely worth the time. So Roman, we haven't even scratched the surface on what's in this book. There's about maybe 6 or 7 things there that I didn't even get to ask you about. So I think people should just get a copy and explore it in depth. Before we wrap up here, can you maybe tell us about this idea of radical hope? And are you the difference between hope and optimism? And are you hopeful for our future?
So I do draw a distinction between optimism and hope. Optimism, I think of as a kind of glass half full, everything's going to be okay attitude despite the evidence. I'm not an optimist. I do think that with business as usual, we are heading as a species for ecological and technological self-termination, really. Who knows when, but that's our direction. But I am hopeful. And by hope and radical hope, I mean being committed to your values and your vision and taking action on it, even if the odds are against you. And I get that hope from the fact that I get that hope in a way from 2 small words, as if. And what I mean by that is, if you look through history, those who've changed their societies, those who, for example, fought against British colonialism in India, knew that they were facing an almost impossible task, but they acted as if change was possible. And I think those words have a kind of power to them that even when it might seem very difficult to change our hopelessly inadequate political and economic systems, but do you really want to get to the end of your life and look back and think that I didn't act as if, that I didn't make change when it may well have been possible to succeed? Because we have sometimes succeeded. And for me, that's enough. And what I've tried to do in this book, History for Tomorrow, is just to show how many instances, and I've only just shown a slither, the tip of the iceberg of the ways in which people have managed to recalibrate the societies that they live in. And I know our task is immense as we look at our world of, turbulence and polycrisis. But let us sort of kind of dig into history, but also look forward with a telescope to the ways that acting as if can change and not be caught in what's sometimes called hopium, hope without action. We need to take action. We need to, get out of the bath sometimes and actually get onto the streets in whatever way and do it with others and shift from that narrow we to the larger we. No, sorry, did I say that wrong? The narrow me to the larger we.
Not sure. But Ronan, I want to say congratulations on writing another brilliant book and wish you the best going forward. Where can people find you online? Where can they get the book? Where would you send people after this conversation as a follow-up?
You can go to my website, romankrznaric.com. And if you can't spell that, which would be fine because I haven't got enough vowels in my name, just look up History for Tomorrow and Roman, or The Good Ancestor, my last book, and Roman, or Empathy and Roman. These kinds of things, you will find me and get yourself the book, or even listen to the audio book narrated by myself. It's the first book I've narrated myself. So see if my dulcet tones set your brain on fire or not. And thank you so much for the conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Roman.